Alright, so now we're going to tie a Caddis Pupa pattern. So caddis, unlike mayflies, have an additional stage in their maturation process, which would be a pupation stage. So Caddis Pupa are a really, really important food source for trout, again, across the country. They're a very vulnerable stage, and a lot of times when you're out on the water and you see trout violently taking what people would refer to as a caddis emerger, they're usually eating Caddis Pupa. So pupa, when they're actually getting ready to emerge, they generate a little gaseous bubble that actually pulls them very rapidly towards the surface of the water. And you'll see trout following them and, again, jumping out of the water, sometimes completely trying to eat these bugs. So there's a lot of different ways to tie Caddis Pupa, and some are very, very realistic, and some are a little bit more general and impressionistic. I, on average, prefer general and impressionistic style flies for this stage. I like to dead drift these flies in a traditional nymphing system. I also like to swing these flies at the end of a dead drift, or sometimes just straight up swinging them downstream like you would a traditional wet fly. Works very well as well. So to get started, we're going to be using an Orvis tactical check nymph hook. This happens to be a size 16. I have a 3/30 seconds or a 2.3 millimeter gold bead on here. This one happens to be brass. You can certainly tie them with tungsten. But I like to definitely make sure you have some lighter weight flies because, as I mentioned, a lot of times the trout are really keen up on bugs that are a little bit higher in the water column, closer to the surface. So if you just have brass, you might find yourself needing to add additional weight sometimes, but if you just have tungsten, you obviously can't take any of that weight of the bead off. So make sure that if you are tying these, that you stagger some weights. So like I said, we're going to get started. For thread, we're going to be using a Vivus 12-aught in kind of this olivey dun color. So we're going to start our thread right behind the bead and work rearwards. Next, we'll nip off our thread. For the tail, we're going to be using a mottled brown section of a Hungarian partridge feather. So I'm just going to preen off a couple of fibers, make sure those tips are even, line that up, and I like those roughly, half a hook shank in length. And again, we're going to tie these down the bend just a little bit. Alright, once we've secured those in, then we're going to add our first ribbing, which is going to be a piece of, in this case, a standard size crystal flash, and this happens to be Mirage Opal. You could use regular pearl, you could use gold, but I do like this kind of opalescent Mirage. And then next, we're going to add a little section of monofilament. Just for some durability. So this is, again, 5X, just like we used on the Caddis larva pattern. We're just going to work that down the shank as well. Moving on to our dubbing, here we're going to be using Caddis Tan life cycle dubbing. As I mentioned with the Caddis larva pattern we tied before, I really like this material for a lot of my Caddis patterns for a couple of reasons. Like I said, it's got a lot of natural materials in here, so you do get a little bit of that kind of buggy, spiky, picked out look. But at the same time, there's also a lot of synthetic in there, so you do get some of the inherent kind of sparkle and sheen associated with the synthetic dubbing. And they also come in a ton of different colors. Like I said, as far as caddis, just about anything you'd ever want. I'm typically tying these flies in tan, usually an olive color, and then also in a fairly bright green, like I said, an insect green, caddis green, something like that. So we're going to advance our thread and dubbing up to about the 3/4 point on the hook shank, maybe a little bit further. And then in this case, now we're going to take our Mirage tinsel and we're going to wrap this the same direction as our dubbing. That's going to get us a nice little tinsely body and secure that. Now, in theory, you could just leave it this way, but for myself, I like durable flies, so now I'm going to take our monofilament and I'm going to counter rib this over the Mirage. It's just going to add a little bit more segmentation and a ton of durability. As I mentioned beforehand, monofilament's quite slippery, so we're going to make sure we're going to secure that very well with a number of different thread wraps. And then we're going to nip that off as well. Next, we're going to advance to our hackle. So this is just a traditional Hungarian partridge hackle. You know, there's a lot of good alternatives out there. A great option would be like these Brahma hen necks from Whiting, but I'm going to stick with the traditional way Anderson tied it, utilizing our Hungarian partridge. You tie them by the tip or by the base. I prefer to tie by the tip personally, but again, it's completely up to you. Once we have that secured, we're going to nip that off. And we don't need a ton of hackle in here. We're really just going to give this 1, maybe 2 full turns of our Hungarian partridge hackle. And get that around. Make sure we're sweeping back our fibers. Try not to trap anything like I just did there. Good. Alright, so once we have our hackle tied into place, same thing, work your thread up through the hackle, trying not to trap any hackle fibers. We're going to tie that off. And I'm going to wrap back over the stem. That's going to add, again, a ton of durability. And also kind of get these hackles to stand up and kick out. So it looks good about there. And the final step would be to get some peacock curl. Depending upon the size, you can use a variety of different strands, but I'm going to do, I think, 2 today. So I'm going to find 2 nice full peacock curls. I'm going to trim off the tips, even them up, secure them right behind the bead, like this. And then we're just going to wrap a few times, build up a nice full little head until we get right to behind our bead here. I'm going to snug those up so they actually are going to slide under the bead and help secure that bead in place. A couple thread wraps over top, nip those off. We're going to add a little bit of super glue here again, as always, for some durability. Whop these fly tire Z-ment on the thread, set that aside, wrap that forward right behind the bead, go for our whip finisher here, whip finish, snug that up, and trim that off. And there you have it, a completed bird of prey Caddis Pupa. A really, really durable, effective little fly. Like I said, you can fish them a lot of different ways, tie them in a bunch of different colors. We did tan today, but olive, insect green, all good options.